Hello and welcome back to the Norse Gods series. Today we're talking about the Norse god Heimdall, the Watchman of the Gods. And we are here at the beautiful Red River Gorge here in Kentucky, right on the edge of a cliff. And that has to do with Heimdall slightly, or at least in a way that makes me feel more connected to him. So we will be talking about the actual facts today, as well as the how to worship and venerate Heimdall in this modern era. This is all going to be compressed into one, just because we don't have that much information about Heimdall, so it didn't really feel necessary to create two separate videos. So it's all here together in one. So out here in nature, we will be talking about the actual veneration of Heimdall today, and then back at my house where it's nice and warm and toasty, we'll be going over the actual facts. But I will leave you with some scenes of this beautiful nature on this wonderful winter day, and then we'll transition inside to talk about what we know about Heimdall from the Poetic and Prose Edda. So this section right here is going to be the fact section, the information section, what we have historically in the sources about Heimdall. So two things about that. One, I do my best to present the information to you in a way that doesn't necessarily give you my opinion. Now that's going to be a little bit harder with Heimdall because there are actually three major points of debate that I could find, and I think there's several more, about information and, about like details about Heimdall that I feel like I probably just need to give you my opinion on, but I want to present to you the multiple arguments as well. Again, there's not a huge amount of information about Heimdall, but there is enough, I think, to build some form of spiritual practice. And then after this section, back on the cliffside, we'll be talking about honoring Heimdall today. I will put like chapter markers down here so you can kind of skip around to where you want to go. But for now, let's move on to the actual facts and information that we know about the Norse god Heimdall. Skull. Now, the two books we're getting the majority of our information from are, of course, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. At this point, you probably know my opinion about the two, and I've kind of found out through this series that a lot of that is in the Prose Edda is just reworded from the Poetic Edda. However, a lot of the times in the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson, after the Poetic Edda, we do get some information that we wouldn't have otherwise. And sometimes I trust it more than other times. If it feels very heavily Christian influence, it does feel like that Snorri kind of added it in there for some more flair, because again, it is important to remember with the Prose Edda, this was written as a textbook on how to write skaldic verse and the history of skaldic verse. So that's how we have to treat this book. It's a textbook about poetry. Final note before we actually get in here, remember, I'm not an expert in Old Norse. I am just a guy practicing this faith, trying to share information with you that I have found out. So this faith is a little bit easier to kind of digest because it can be hard to go through these very dense books and learn about these deities. So I do apologize, but I hope you find him funny at the same time when I mispronounce some of these very crazy and often silly words. So the first poem I'm going to read to you from is, of course, the Voluspa, which contains a lot of the information about a lot of the deities and gives us an overview of a lot of the major historical and mythological points that we really need to focus on. So there are only three stanzas where Heimdall is mentioned. I think I'm just going to run through all three and then we'll discuss them just a little bit. So stanza 1. Heed my words, all classes of men, you greater and lesser children of Heimdall. Stanza 27. I know where Heimdall hid his ear under the heaven-bright, holy branches of Yggdrasil. I see a river that feeds the muddy waterfall where Odin's eye hides. Stanza 45. The giants are at play, and the god's fate is kindled at the blast of Gjallar horn. Heimdall blows that horn hard, holds it high aloft, and Odin speaks with Mimir's head. So that first stanza, stanza 1, is reference to Rigismal, which is something that we'll get to a little bit later. And so that's really, we'll get to that later, but really this is just a callback to another poem, which I always love to see, and I know a lot of us really love to see, is references among the literature, because it gives us some backbone to the content and some, credibility to what we're reading. This is something that I think we see a lot because Voluspa is such a popular poem, and it's the first line of the Voluspa. I mean, Heimdall is mentioned right away. the greater and lesser children of Heimdall. Now, stanza 27, the mentioning of his ear, is something that I've really connected to and something that I've been working on in my personal practice, kind of calling to. Now, in this stanza, we actually get the first moment of debate among scholars in a translation of an Old Norse word. So the word is Hylliod, which they have sometimes translated, the scholars, as ear, hearing, or horn. And so some translations will switch these out. And so within the translation that I was using, the Jackson Crawford translation, it was ear. Now, I don't really know. I can't really say one way or another. The translation I have heard is ear, and I think that makes sense. And I've also heard a translation where it's given his ear to Mimir's well, or where he's hidden his ear in the well. So I've heard this many times, so that's what I've grown used to, but just to let you know that there is a debate of what Hylliod means. And if you don't know Old Norse, maybe you know more than these scholars. I'm not really sure, but that's the information for you. Again, I think I lean more towards the ear and the hearing aspect. And then, of course, stanza 45, we have the beginning and the end, which is Völuspá. And so in stanza 45, we have the reference to Ragnarok and the role that Heimdall plays in this, which is the blowing of Gjallar horns, signaling that Ragnarok has begun. So this is a really big moment in, the mythos of the Nordic world. I mean, Ragnarok is something that many people know about because it's one of the most popular terms, probably next to Valhalla, that anyone on the streets would probably know about the Norse mythology. And this is probably one of the main features of Heimdall that most people know about. And this is also one of the main features that we can connect with as practitioners of this faith today, which is the aspect of blowing the horn. I just realized it makes way more sense for me to put this in the background than the drums, so I'm going to switch that out real quick. And also, to make my neighbors hate me. So yes, Völuspá, brief introduction into a lot of the major mythology that we know about Heimdall, including Rigismo, which we'll talk about here very soon, and then the horn as well, and then the mysteriousness of his ear hidden in Mimir as well. Again, this is something I kind of want to talk about a little bit later, but this is an interesting thing that I've been connecting with personally in my research and explorations into Heimdall. Now in Grimnismal, we get one stanza about Heimdall, and it's about his hall. Heimdall inhabits the 8th hall, Himinbjord. This is where he is the master. In that pleasant house, the watchman of the gods happily drinks his good mead. And so, while it's a small line, I mean, obviously this is another aspect that we can kind of call to or know about him is Himinbjörn, but also the good mead, I think, is a really good line here. Him being connected to maybe brewing in a way. I mean, Aegir is really the only brewing god we know of, but the saying of his good mead. Does he make mead? Is he a mead aficionado? I'm not really sure, but I think this is something that we as practitioners of this faith today can connect with, is that Heimdall is connected with good mead in some way. And now here we are at Lokasenna, the poem I always have to mention in basically every Norse god's video, because basically every god is mentioned here and Loki insults everybody. And Heimdall is no different, so I will just read that to you. Stanza 47, starting with Heimdall insulting Loki. You're drunk, Loki, drunk to the point of foolishness. Why don't you control yourself? This kind of drunkenness makes every man say more than he means to. Loki in return, in stanza 48, silence, Heimdall. In the old days, a miserable fate was assigned to you. You have to stand all the time, stay watchful all the time as the guardian of the gods. And so this kind of references a possible oath or a duty that was given to Heimdall at some point, which I've had a couple great conversations with people in the community about where this kind of came from. And so this is, we see this reference later in the Prose Edda, that he is the watchman of the gods, that he basically can never sleep. He has to constantly stay vigilant and look for the signs of Ragnarok and protect Asgard from invasions by giants. But it's very interesting to see Loki use this as an insult. We think this is a positive aspect of Heimdall, but with all the gods, there's a dual side to everything they do. I mean, with Odin, his wisdom, it leads to madness. Thor and his strength, leads to him, dying in the end. So a lot of times there's a two-sided coin with a lot of benefits to the gods. And maybe with Heimdall here, it's no different. This aspect of forever watching is actually a negative thing at the same time, or can be seen that way. Now, I don't know if we can look at it too much here, but, Heimdall being the voice of drunkenness here, saying, hey, you're too drunk. I mean, he's not directly saying to Loki, like, oh, you're just a terrible person. He's saying, hey, you're drinking too much. Maybe you should slow down. So maybe there's a little bit of a kindness here. I'm not really sure, but, that's kind of how I read into it a little bit. Now, this next one comes from Heimskida, which is the story of Thor's hammer Mjolnir being stolen by the giants, and then him getting in the wedding dress. But this is very interesting because I forgot this was a point in the story, is the person's idea who it was to put Thor in the wedding dress was actually Heimdall. In stanza 15, then Heimdall spoke, the handsomest of the gods. As one of the Vanir, he could see the future. Let's put a wedding dress on Thor. Let him wear Freya's necklace, the Brisingamen. Well, that isn't kind of funny. Now, there are actually a few things to dig into here. One, the fact that Heimdall was referenced as a Vanir, which we'll see later in the Prose Edda that he's listed as one of the Aesir gods. So this is going to be something that kind of leads to one of the confusions about Heimdall. Is he Vanir or is he Aesir? And then there's also the tying of him to Brisingamen, which we'll see later in the Prose Edda as well, that it is referenced that Heimdall was involved in the thieving of Brisingamen in a story we basically don't know anymore that is referenced in the Prose Edda. So we see that packed into it here as well. And then we have the second moment of debate within the scholarly community about Heimdall, and that comes from the word of Hivitastu. Now, what Crawford went for in his translation was handsomest, but I've also seen translations that put this word as the glittering one, the brightest one, and the whitest one, which is very interesting. Now, something I will say here, when it translates to the whitest one, and this is where some debate comes from, is that, people think that's referring to like his race, but the concept of race really didn't exist in the past, at least not in the way that they would define themselves as white. And so I don't think that this is really anything to do with his race, or anything like that. I think this just has to do with his physical appearance, his glowingness. Whiteness would be used as a term for glowing. Now, maybe that's outstretching my, arm as a YouTuber and not a scholar, but considering the other translations are a glittering one and shining one, I don't think if it was used as the term of whitest god, again, I don't think this is something about race. I think this is something about his physical attribute of glowing. But really, what I focus on in this stanza is that Heimdall's a funny motherfucker, because he's the one that was like, you know what, Thor, what would be a great idea is if you put on a wedding dress and go and take your hammer back. Like, come on, Thor is this like big, burly, redheaded dude. He's like, we'll just throw a wedding dress on you, put a necklace on you, and call you Freya. Like, Heimdall's a funny dude. And now we've arrived at Rigisthula, which is the story of Rig. And this is also the third and final moment of big debate about Heimdall. Now, there's a couple things wrapped into this. I think the main debate comes around the fact that this story is about the formation of the social classes of man. And so I think there's a lot of debate on whether how deeply we should look into this, or the validity of the story. But there's also a debate, and this is the one I was kind of interested in, is whether or not Rig is actually Heimdall. Because it does say in the prose of this story, so the poem that comes with this story in Old Norse, it says that Rig is Heimdall. But if you actually look at the attributes and you look at the story, it doesn't seem like something that Heimdall, based on the other information that we have, would actually participate in. Because Heimdall is stuck at Asgard, being the watchman of the gods. How does he have time to wander around and sleep with people? So I'm not really sure. This is more of a personal thing, but I think the best way to handle this story is just to go ahead and I'm going to tell you kind of the blueprint of the story, because I don't really have time in one video to read the whole dang thing. And then I'm going to look at specific stanzas that give us information about who Rig is, and how that maybe could help you in a spiritual practice. So Rig is a deity who is traveling around, and this is kind of a repetitive story with a repeating pattern. And so he arrives at this first house, which is of slaves, basically, of the lower class, and he ends up spending 3 nights with them and sleeping with his husband and wife. And then they have a child, which is basically the representation of the lower class of man. And then he goes to the next house, which is the middle class, the freemen, the free workers, the traders, the merchants, and he spends 3 nights with them, gives them a good counsel, and sleeps with them, and produces another child who is the middle class. And then he goes again on his journey, finds the upper class, the lords, the kings, and he spends 3 nights with them, and lo and behold, produces a child. And at the end of the poem, which we'll dig into here in the specific stanzas, he actually spends time, Rig does, with the child of the upper class and teaches them the runes until that child becomes so good at the runes that they overtake him and take his name, which is very strange. So a very weird and interesting poem. And so let me just kind of dive into the specific stanzas here that I think will give us some information about Rig that might be pertaining to a practice. In stanza 1, we have a description of Rig. It is said there is a wise god, Rig, powerful in age, fierce and strong, walked upon green roads. Okay. And then stanza 34, after kind of all of the sexual adventures, he comes upon the child, Lord, who was the child of the upper class. And then Rig came walking to their farm. He taught Lord runes, gave his own name, called him son, and told him to claim lands and conquer villages. And then in stanza 43, Rig shared the runes with him, young king, which is the son of Lord. But King tricked him and learned them better than he, and earned the right to call himself by the name of Rig for his rune lore. Kind of weird that's kind of the story. Again, my argument here, if I have an argument to make, is even though it does say that this is Heimdall, I'm not questioning that the text doesn't say this, but this doesn't seem like Heimdall. This seems like Odin. I mean, he's described as wise and old, a wanderer, and a fornicator, and teaches runes to a child. This has Odin written all over it. So if literally we didn't have that one line saying that this was Heimdall, I think everyone would assume this is Odin. But ultimately, I don't know how much this helps you in a personal practice, and that's really why you're watching this video. Is there a lot of aspects we can call to here? I mean, again, this is the opening line, the Voluspa, referring to mankind as the children of Heimdall, is an interesting way maybe to connect with him. Maybe he is, you can see him as wise, maybe he does have rune knowledge, but this story kind of exists in its own pocket universe because there's really nothing else out there in any written source material to kind of back up this story as Heimdall. So I'm not really sure how much it's going to be able to help you, but that is the story of Rig. Okay, you see this spot right here. I came out here, got everything set up, got the intro horn blowing set up for you, and then I went around and I slipped on some ice that were under snow, and I very well could have gone off the edge of this cliff. It is honestly the nature of doing nature photography in kind of precarious areas, but this is my way of saying, if you like the content here at the Wisdom of Odin, and like the fact that I actually do sometimes risk my life for some shots, please think about heading over to Patreon and donating there to support this channel. Additionally, we have just launched our nonprofit organization, and so the website is down below if you want to check out upcoming gatherings and maybe even how to support us in the future when building the hall. So please check out that down below. But yeah, what an adventurous day it's been out here at Red River Gorge in the snowy mountains. But yeah, back to the video. All right, and that is the Poetic Edda. So the Poetic Edda has the majority of the information we know about Heimdall. The Prose Edda really just has a long description of him and a small amount of minor details that we kind of can see come from a different source material that we don't actually have anymore and that was lost throughout time, which is sad, but it is nice that we have the echoes of another source about Heimdall that once existed. So right here in the Prose Edda, the description of Heimdall is given as follows. There is one Aesir called Heimdall. He is known as the White Az. He is great and holy. 9 maidens bore him as their son, all of them sisters. He is also called Halanskidi and Golantani. His teeth were of gold. His horse is called Golta. He lives in a place called Himinbjorg by Bifrost. He is the god's watchman and sits there at the edge of heaven to guard the bridge against mountain giants. He needs less sleep than a bird. He can see by the night just as well as by day, a distance of 100 leagues. He can also hear grass growing on the earth and wool on sheeps, and everything that sounds louder than that. He has a trumpet called Gjallarhorn. Blast can be heard in all the worlds. The head is referred to as Heimdall's sword. So that is the description given by Snorri about Heimdall. So you get a lot of information there that we don't get in the Poetic Edda. And again, it seems to be because this is referenced in an unknown writing that was lost throughout time. So things that we are given here is him being born of 9 maidens, and this is something that a lot of people have made speculations about, or who these 9 maidens are. There are rumors that it could be the 9 waves, which are the daughters of Ran and Aegir, or it could be the 9 giantesses referenced in the very beginning of Voluspa as well. But regardless, this is a very interesting aspect that it seems like a lot of people have theories about. And we're also given a more poetic look of what Heimdall's life could have been. He sits at the edge of heaven, guarding the Bifrost. His hall is at the Bifrost, the watchman of the gods. So these are all things that might be poetic antidotes added by Snorri, but at the same time it builds a more complete image of what Heimdall's role was in Asgard. Now, the reference to his improved sight and hearing are not something that we see in the Poetic Edda, but again, seems to be aspects that a lot of people connect with, and something myself that I've kind of looked deeper into as far as his ability to hear things, and even the giving up of his ear or hearing into Mimir as well, or into the World Tree, that maybe this is one of the aspects that gave him this ability. So again, just something very interesting and small to look into. Now, Snorri does actually list his sources. Look at that, in the 13th century, listing your sources. What a guy. And a poem of Heimdallr Galdr, which from what I can tell doesn't actually exist in any of our modern writings. If it does, please let me know. But he does reference it here, and it references a line from there saying that he's the offspring of 9 mothers and 9 sisters, the sun. So basically showing where he got that information from. So we can kind of infer that this information is actually accurate. Snorri's retelling of Ragnarok, we do see that Loki and Heimdall will be the death of one another. This is not something that we see in the Poetic Edda version of the Völuspá and the slaying of Heimdall at Ragnarok. And so it's kind of interesting that, you know, Snorri, I don't know if Snorri just kind of poetically did this, but according to Snorri in the Prose Edda, Heimdall and Loki will be the death of one another. There are other couple smaller mentionings of Heimdall that I really don't, you know, feel the need to kind of give you like basically the direct reading. Essentially that Heimdall is going to be at Baldr's funeral and that he rides in the funeral procession. I mean, something very small, you know, he's really just a background character there. Now the final entry here is kind of the different ways you can call to Heimdall in kennings, which is, again, the main purpose of the Prose Edda, which is the writing of poetry. So I'm going to kind of read this to you because it does give us some very interesting, you know, a summary of whom Heimdall is. Heimdall shall be referred to as the son of 9 mothers, guardian of the gods, as was written above, or the white Oz, Loki's enemy, recoverer of Freya's necklace. A sword is called Heimdall's head. It is said that he was struck through with a man's head. He is the subject of the poem Heimdallr Galdr, and ever since the head has been called Heimdall's doom. A man's doom is an expression for a sword. Heimdall is the owner of Gulltopp. He is also the visitor of Vagaskr and Singastein on the occasion that he contended with Loki for Brisingabin. He is also known as Heimdallr. It is mentioned that Loki and Heimdall were in the form of seals during that story. Wait, what? So again, this is very, like, this kind of reminds me when I did the Yule video, and it just, like, there was a random mentioning of, like, dolphins, a dolphin at a feast, which, you know, was supposedly actually happened. And then we just have this random line here where it says, it is mentioned that Loki and Heimdall were in the forms of seals during that story. And so there's, like, this lost story out there where Heimdall and Loki were fighting each other in the form of seals. And it's like, what? I want to read that story. But we sadly don't have it. It's been lost to time. But yes, apparently there's a story out there where Heimdall and Loki fought as seals. And then the final line, and then the final line here is that he is also the son of Odin, which is something that's just kind of randomly thrown in there. Oh, and I forgot to mention that on page 56 of my translation, Heimdall is listed as one of the Aesir gods, even though he was considered a Vanir god in the Poetic Edda. So again, more inconsistencies in this faith in the information we have. So that is all we have from the Prose Edda about Heimdall. It's not a lot. Really, we just get the 9 mothers thing. We get the reference from a couple of stories that we don't know anymore. We know that he, you know, fights Loki as the form of a seal in one of the stories, and according to Snorri, they kill each other at Ragnarok. So again, not a lot of information here, just really a way to kind of round out what we know about Heimdall. Now, as with many of the Norse gods videos, I do have a section here for artifacts. There are 2 that I could find where it seems like a figure that could be Heimdall is featured in some form of rock carving. So the first one here comes from a cross, and it shows a man fighting what looks like a serpent or a dragon, and he also is holding a horn. So we don't have something under this that says this is Heimdall, but seeing a figure with a horn makes most people and most scholars seem to believe that this could be Heimdall. And then there's also a 10th century carving on the Isle of Man, which features a person, a figure blowing a horn. Again, we don't have something here that says this is Heimdall, but again, a lot of scholars seem to believe that this figure blowing a horn could be Heimdall. Now, the only thing I have left here to say in the actual fact-based section is I saw echoes of an argument made in several papers that the 9 mothers are connected to the 9 waves of Aegir and Ran, and that this connection and his defending of the border of Asgard shows that he is connected to the ocean in some way as a boundary guardian, which kind of makes sense because, this could be the boundary of the realms of the gods. I tried to find this actual paper, this actual argument, who wrote it, but this is something that's kind of influenced my own arguments in my mind and explorations into Heimdall. But I wanted to say that it does seem like scholars have argued that the 9 goddesses, the 9 mothers of Heimdall were actually the 9 waves, so there could be some validity to this. All right, and that is the majority of information that we have about Heimdall. I'm sure there's a few minor things that I've missed, but as with all the Norse God series, I want to just give you the majority, 95% of the information here for you in one video so you can build and base your own practice off of. Again, there are 3 major things about debate, and there's a lot of all the information. That's really what I've come to, realize about Heimdall, is there's a lot of information about various things that don't really seem like they connect. And so we're really trying, and I'm trying to connect these things, these various stories and bits of information into some form of cohesive understanding of who Heimdall is. He is a very mysterious god, and I think that's part of the charm about following and venerating Heimdall, which is something that I'm trying to do this coming year, is connecting more with him. But now I want to take you back to the cliffside so we can talk about how I'm exploring this relationship with the Norse god Heimdall, and how possibly you can build a relationship and a practice around honoring and venerating him as well. All right, welcome back to the beauty of Kentucky and discussing the Norse god Heimdall today and how to honor and venerate him. The biggest way and the easiest way, and the one I think is the most obvious from the research, is blowing a horn like he does at Ragnarok. And I've been doing this personally quite a bit anytime I've been speaking with him or giving offerings to him. And I've been finding that the results are really favorable. I mean, starting out offering by saying, "Heimdall, watcher of the gods, I blow this horn for you to signify what you do at Ragnarok," and blowing the horn, it's really amazing stuff. Now, what about more physical offerings as far as, giving him something? I really do think that mead is a great one. I mean, especially since we have his name, his hall, and mead all in the same stanza. I think this is a really great offering to give him. But another aspect that I've been recommending to people for a long time is sacrificing your sleep. Something we see in the Prose Edda is that he gets very little sleep and he has to stay vigilant all the time for signs of Ragnarok. So giving up your sleep for him, I think, is an amazing connection that you can actually have with him. And anytime that we've had the Suna nights or soul days, whatever you want to call it, at our Yule gatherings where we stay up all night to greet the morning sun, I always call out to Heimdall either before or after in that ritual to say, hey, we also did this as a sign for you, as an offering to you, because, you give up sleep to protect Asgard. But ultimately, this is a type of offering. It's not something we think about, it's not something we read about, but time and giving up your sleep is a really great way to connect to the gods, and especially to this time of year. This was the longest night of the year, and you made it through it, and that's really exciting. So be proud of yourselves. And with that, give him things that help him not sleep. I think coffee would be a really good offering as well to give to Heimdall, to kind of show that connection as well. Hey, you give up sleep, here's something to help you keep you going in a way. It's a little bit of a cheeky gift, but I think Heimdall's a little bit of a cheeky god because he's, the whole Thor wedding dress thing, I think he appreciates a little bit of humor. So what is the reason I'm actually at this cliff face at the edge of two worlds, really? And that is because of the research that I have done about Heimdall, and what has been presented in that research is the guardian of borders, the guardian of Asgard and the border into Midgard and the Bifrost and all these things. He's that boundary. And so I really started connecting with that, and the more I started thinking about Heimdall, the more I started thinking about boundaries between realms. So here I am on the edge of the world, at the edge of rock into the abyss, and then also if I was near water, I could do on the edge of water into that. And that's something that is really stuck in my mind, is the guardian of boundaries. Now, something I also have practiced is actually at this California gathering, I used him as kind of a protector god as far as creating a boundary. So on that first night, I actually went into the woods with a few people in the community, and I gave an offering, basically announcing ourselves to the land, announcing ourselves to the gods, saying that we're here to celebrate the old ways. And I called out to Heimdall to ask for protection, as he was the guardian of the gods, so maybe he can be the guardian of us. So yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I connected with, is this protector spirit, the protector of boundaries, the creator of boundaries as far as that. I don't know if it actually will go anywhere, but this is kind of the way that I'm exploring to connect with him. And that's something I really want to encourage you to do on this path as well, as you find these breadcrumb trails and follow them. See where they take you. See if you can find more breadcrumbs. Fill in those breadcrumb trails with your personal experiences and the experiences of others. That's how we're going to continue to explore and learn from this faith today. So another experience I want to share with you that I've been kind of bringing Heimdall into my personal practice is into my shamanic work. And so shamanism in the shamanic practice is really traveling the world tree, at least in the Nordic context. And so for me, when I've been doing this, when I've been getting to Asgard, I mean, that's part of the realm travel, the spirit walking, whatever you want to call it. And so part of my bit into going into this is asking Heimdall permission to enter Asgard, because that felt right. That felt like something I needed to do. And so in this ritual, in that Odin ritual that I performed at the Ohio Yule Gathering with Caleb and a few other men in the community, when we got to the point where we were ready to ascend into the world tree, into the realms, we had a moment where we stopped and we all blew our horns for Heimdall.
Heimdall! We seek an audience with you! We seek to enter Asgard! Hear our cries and hear our horns!
And how was it? Was it successful? Yes. Again, this is following those breadcrumb trails. I saw, okay, he's protector of Asgard, so maybe we have to ask permission to get in. You know, we have the horn connecting to it, so bring it into a ritual and see what happens. And it felt like a really powerful experience, having everyone stop, silence to happen, and then the horns to blow. It was pretty amazing. Now, where I think it starts getting kind of weird with Heimdall, where I start getting a little crazy, is all the different bits of information that exist about him. Because you have the nine mothers, the 9 waves over here. You have the Bifrost and rainbows. You have the horn and Gjallar horn, the blowing of the horn for Ragnarok. And then you have the whole rig thing like way over here in the stratosphere. And it's like, how do we connect all these things into one practice? And I would really say, like I said earlier about the borders, is, okay, there's something with the borders here, right? Okay, he guards the border of Asgard. He's got something with rainbows. And then maybe there's something with the 9 waves. But what if, oh my gosh, rainbows, they're created by the sun coming in and hitting water droplets and reflecting it and creating colors. Okay, so then maybe that's Heimdall too. And maybe the waves, the ocean spray, people saw the ocean spray and were like, oh my gosh, that's Heimdall. And that's how you get into Asgard. Oh my God. This is really where I start going a little crazy, but also where I really love the research into Heimdall is because it's a lot of individual breadcrumbs with miles between some of the points. And so really trying to figure out what fits in the middle of those, I think is really exciting. But with that, thank you for joining me for this video, this Norse God series, and discussing Heimdall today. I hope it's been informative. I hope I've inspired you, especially since I almost died this episode. I am really not overplaying that. That could have gone really badly. But thank you all so much for watching this series. I do have the Norse Gods Frigg coming up here in a couple of weeks, and really that's kind of ending the series because we're running out of deities to talk about that have enough information to create an entire video about them. So I do believe I'm going to do Freyr after that, but after that, it's getting pretty light. So if you have any suggestions of deities you want me to cover that have enough context that I can talk about in an entire episode, please put them down below, and please make sure you check out the previous Norse Gods series. Other than that, thank you all very much, and until the hall, Skull.